الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we listen to beautiful recitation of the Quran, to reflect upon the meanings of it, focusing on the verses that has something or mentions women in it. And women in Islam, as we heard and as we know, something that is shows how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala miraculously the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are established in the lives of the believers, and they should follow it. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He revealed the Quran and the way the Prophet ﷺ, that He's the creator of everyone, the creator of men and women. So it's only the human beings that they get corrupted when they turn away from the source of their guidance and the source of happiness, which is the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all the different types of abuse, when it comes to the rights of women, the rights of whoever, all of that is because of the turning away from the source of guidance and the source of happiness in this life, which is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And if people hold fast to the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and holding fast to it, that means they would get to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from them, that they would apply it in their life, they would have then the best of this life and in the hereafter, especially when it comes to the rights to be observed. The entire religion of Islam is based on rights. Rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the rights of the human beings in our life, and each and every human being in our life, there are things in the deen of Allah, in the religion of Islam, that basically admonish our hearts to fulfill these rights according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. So continuing with the same matter, inshallah ta'ala, and this time, inshallah ta'ala, in this episode, we'll go through some verses from Surah Luqman and Surah Al-Ahzab. And we'll start, inshallah ta'ala, with Surah Luqman and verse number 12. But before we start, I would like to introduce the reciters. That with us today, we have Sheikh Abdul Khaliq Atiyah. Barakallahu feekum wa alaykum assalam wa barakatuh. Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im. Barakallahu feekum. Sheikh Ahmad Rajab. Jazakumullah khairan for coming, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for the effort and the recitation. So we'll start, inshallah ta'ala, with Surah Luqman and verse number 12 all the way to verse number 15. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ولقد آتينا لقمان الحكمة أن اشكر لله ومن يشكر فإنما يشكر لنفسه ومن كفر فإن الله غني حميد. وإذ قال لقمان لابنه وهو يعظه يا بني لا تشرك بالله إن الشرك لظلم عظيم. ووصينا الإنسان بوالديه حملته أمه وهنا على وهن وفصاله في عامين أن اشكر لي ولوالديك إلي المصير. وإن جاهداك على أن تشرك بي ما ليس لك به علم فلا تطعهما وصاحبهما في الدنيا معروفا واتبع سبيل من أناب إلي ثم إلي مرجعكم فأنبئكم بما كنتم تعملون.
MashaAllah, barakallahu feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. These verses in Surah Luqman, and as we know that Luqman, he advised his son with these words of wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to be in the final revelation to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, for the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam to learn from it. And as we heard, and this is just a portion of it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that when he gave Luqman this wisdom, to be grateful to Allah. So not everybody is given wisdom. It's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when someone, a favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is bestowed upon him, he should be grateful to Allah. And whoever is grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that doesn't benefit the creator of the heavens and the earth anything. He's being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his own self. He gets the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a result of that. And the opposite of shukr or gratefulness is al-kufr, wal-'iyadhu billah. To be ungrateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is such an evil act. And then the verses talks about the advice that Luqman had towards his son while he was advising him, while he was admonishing him to affect his heart and to make him firm and steadfast upon the truth. The first and the most important of all, of course, for both men and women, is forbidding him from associating partners with Allah, because that's the worst injustice that can ever occur on the face of earth. And by the way, since the verses afterwards talks about the parents, which is why we chose these verses, for someone to be righteous to the parents really can never be perceived in the right way unless a person is fulfilling the rights of Allah. How can you sincerely fulfill the rights of other human beings if you're not fulfilling the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When someone is committing the worst injustice ever, which is associating partners with Allah, disbelieving in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can that person be entrusted with anything else? And that's why right after that, after the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the people through these verses and the advices of Luqman to his son to take care of parents. وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ. And what's mentioned there is the parents, regardless of their religion, how good or bad they are, just the fact that they are the parents, the father and the mother. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the mother first, because she has even more right than the father. And when we say more right than the father, it doesn't mean to undermine the right of the father. But if it's either or, definitely the mother is to come forward. And this is in the Quran and this is in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and reminding the human beings what they already know. So that something in the heart should be well established in there. The mother, she carried her son, weakness after weakness, and then she weans him for 2 years. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminding the human beings with that so that he is grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and grateful to the parents. And when people do not remember this, and of course they won't remember, none of us remember when he was or she was in the womb of her mother. And none of us remember when they were weaned and when their mother would breastfeed them. None of us remember these things. But it's all is happening, and we see that in other individuals in our life. But it's very important for us when we reach the age of puberty, when we are raised and we grow up, then to remember this. Go back and remember with your own heart how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took care of you when you were in the womb of your mother, when she gave birth to you, when she took care of you, right? So that the person is constantly grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to their parents. It doesn't matter how good or bad the parents are. Many or some of their children, the ignorance that they would have if their parents did not give them some money, for example, or they disciplined them, they forget about how things were. And they become so ungrateful. And they become so much having bad manners towards their parents. And that's why the Quran reminds us, something that should never escape our hearts whatsoever. So it shows the virtues of motherhood in Islam. Something that for the women, they should seek this level. When something is praised in the Quran, then we should seek that level. And this can never be attained except for the females. So a Muslim woman, she wants to get married so that she would be a mother by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that she can gain this great reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for the children, whether it's men or women, to fulfill the rights of their parents and the rights of their mother. And this right is to the extent of which that if they are disbelievers and they're taking all of the means to get their son or daughter to be a disbeliever, never to obey them in this, of course, because this is the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but to continue to have a good companionship with them. So the advisors go on with these precious advices from Luqman to his son, making him conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to establish the salah, to enjoin the good, forbid the evil, and to be patient as a result of that, and with the verses, as we heard, to avoid arrogance and the like of this. But we will continue inshallah ta'ala, but going to Surah Al-Ahzab. Surah Al-Ahzab, from the beginning of Surah Al-Ahzab to verse number 6. From the beginning of Surah Al-Ahzab to verse number 6. And Sheikh Ayman, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها النبي اتق الله ولا تطع الكافرين والمنافقين إن الله كان عليما حكيما. واتبع ما يوحى إليك من ربك إن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. إن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. وتوكل على الله وكفى بالله وكيلا. ما جعل الله لرجل من قلبين في جوفه وما جعل أزواجكم اللائي تظاهرون منهن أمهاتكم وما جعل أدعياءكم أبناءكم ذلكم قولكم بأفواهكم والله يقول الحق وهو يهدي السبيل. ادعوهم لآبائهم هو أقسط عند الله فإن لم تعلموا آباءهم فإخوانكم في الدين ومواليكم وليس عليكم جناح فيما أخطأتم به ولكن ما تعمدت قلوبكم وكان الله غفورا رحيما. النبي أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم وأزواجه أمهاتهم وأولو الأرحام بعضهم أولى ببعض في كتاب الله من المؤمنين والمهاجرين إلا أن تفعلوا إلى أوليائكم معروفا كان ذلك في الكتاب مسطورا.
بارك الله فيك. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. The Surah Al-Ahzab, which is translated as the Confederates, referring to the Battle of Al-Ahzab, but also it mentions other things with it, and it shows some of the crises that happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and also within the household of the Prophet ﷺ. But at the beginning of Surah Al-Ahzab, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala he addressing the Prophet ﷺ to fear Allah, to be obedient to Allah, not to obey the disbelievers and the hypocrites, and to follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him ﷺ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is well acquainted with everyone and what they do, and to put his trust on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ fulfilled that perfectly. And this is one of the miraculous things, that these commands from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet ﷺ, to the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ, he applied that perfectly, to the extent of which that he is the example for each and every one of us to follow when it comes to how to practically fulfill these qualities and these characteristics. Then the verses talked about a practice that used to be at the time of Jahiliyyah, before the religion of Islam, that a man, he would forbid his wife from his own self by saying that his wife is like the back of his mother, meaning that she is forbidden for him to touch her or to approach her like the same way that he would treat his mother. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed verses in the beginning of Surah Al-Ahzab about this and how evil that action is, and to expiate the sin of such a statement, even if it's when a person is angry, if he says something like this, forbidding his wife for his own self, the expiation of that is mentioned in other surah in the Quran, but it shows how evil that is, because it's lying, and his wife is not his mother, so never to say that. And this is something that they would utter with their mouths, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the truth. And the same thing when it comes to those who they adopt, and they would give their names to their adopted children. This is a lie. They are not their biological fathers, so don't give them your name, and call them with their fathers if their fathers are known. If their fathers are not known, then to their mothers. And they are your brothers for the sake of Allah. And this is something not to undermine the rights of these types of children, but rather to honor them and to raise them in a good way, but to forbidding the believers from having any form of lie whatsoever. So this is one thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet ﷺ with regards to their wives, to observe their rights and to treat them in a good way. Also, one of the things that is mentioned with regards to the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, that the Prophet ﷺ have more rights to the believers than their own selves. So your own self, everyone is greedy by nature. So you want to rest, you want to eat, you want to fulfill your desire. The Prophet ﷺ have more rights to you than your own self. Meaning that if he commands you to do something and your own desire is opposing this, which one that you're supposed to submit yourself to? Not your desires, but the commands of the Prophet ﷺ. Follow his way and follow the truth that the Prophet ﷺ brought for you. And this is at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and after the Prophet ﷺ. But then the verses praises the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, that they are the mothers of the believers. They are your mothers, and no one would ever dare to cause any harm to his mother if he's a decent person, with words, with actions. And this is something that is, every Muslim is addressed by this. So therefore, those who would accuse the mothers of the believers, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, of any evil, they are very evil. They are extremely evil. And it can be in the state of disbelief, wal-'iyadhu billah. So this is something that is mentioned, to praise them, to mention them with all matters of goodness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made their speech and actions to show that clearly, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purified them. The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose them to be the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's all the status of these women in the religion of Islam. The next set of verses, inshallah ta'ala, which is also in Surah Al-Ahzab, but verses 28 to 34. 28 to 34. And Shaykh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها النبي قل لأزواجك إن كنتن تردن الحياة الدنيا وزينتها فتعالين أمتعكن وأسرحكن سراحا جميلا وإن كنتن تردن الله ورسوله والدار الآخرة فإن الله أعد للمحسنات منكن أجرا عظيما يا نساء النبي من يأت منكن بفاحشة مبينة يضاعف لها العذاب ضعفين وكان ذلك على الله يسيرا ومن يقنت منكن لله ورسوله وتعمل صالحا نؤتها أجرها مرتين وأعتدنا لها رزقا كريما يا نساء النبي لستن كأحد من النساء إن اتقيتن فلا تخضعن بالقول فيطمع الذي في قلبه مرض وقلن قولا معروفا وقرن في بيوتكن ولا تبرجن تبرج الجاهلية الأولى وأقمنا الصلاة وآتينا الزكاة وأطعنا الله ورسوله إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا واذكرن ما يتلى في بيوتكن من آيات الله والحكمة إن الله كان لطيفا خبيرا.
ما شاء الله, بارك الله فيك. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. As we see the Surah Al-Ahzab, where it talks about the household of the Prophet ﷺ and etiquettes to be observed by the believers, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed His favor upon the Prophet ﷺ and the wives of the Prophet ﷺ for them to be firm upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we heard in the verses, that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ was given a choice by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they are seeking this worldly life and the adornment of this worldly life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet ﷺ to say to his wife then, or his wives in this case, I would let you go and I would divorce you if this is what you're seeking. But if you seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and the last day, then indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared for the good doers among you a great reward from Allah. And what was the response from each and every one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ? That they chose Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated the level and gave them great rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is sufficient that they are the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in this life and in the hereafter, in the Jannah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared for them. And to show that their virtue is because of their actions, not because of anything else, that He subhanahu wa ta'ala addressed them that if you do good, you will get rewards for it, and if you do evil, you will have double of the punishment, and your goodness will be multiplied if you do good. And of course, all of them, they submitted themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it shows there again their virtue and their level. The rewards are multiplied, and also the punishment, if they would commit sins, are multiplied, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved them from this. Also, what they have been addressed with, which is also for the believing women, that they to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forbidding them from softening their voice whenever they would speak to other men, so that the ones that have diseases in their hearts, the disease of desire and lust, so that they don't commit sin as a result of that, and for them to be established and to stay in their houses. And this is for them and the believing women, and to have the comfort of their eyes when they are at home. And this is one of the essence of the word waqarna, that also has to do something with the comfort of your eyes to be at home. This is your original place. This is where you need to be comfortable in. This is where you need to stay in. And then you leave, of course, if there's a need for you to leave your home, but this is your place that you're supposed to be well acquainted and comfortable with and staying in. And also He forbade them and the females among the believers from adorning themselves or conducting themselves in the way of the people of ignorance before the religion of Islam. And if you see how the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they mention about what some of the things of the women in the times of ignorance they used to do, where she would have her scarf to recede a little bit back, where her neck will show, part of her arm will show. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade them from, or walking in a way that would show their bodies and things like this. And subhanAllah, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade them from this, and this is called something from the beginning or the first stage of ignorance. And to establish the salah and to give the zakah and to be obedient to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purified the household of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam and the believers, and also to mention what has been recited in their homes from the ayat of Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. All of that to show the level of virtue. And as we see here, this is a message for each and every one of us, and for the Muslim women to hold fast to these examples, not to look for those who are deviated from the truth, not to imitate the disbelieving women, not to imitate the disobedient women to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who the shaitan overpower them by making them showing their adornments, by not observing the hijab, by showing their hairs, by showing their bodies to strangers. This is such an evil act, and it's a sinful thing. And how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the believing women to have modesty, to have shyness, and to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by following the examples of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We'll continue inshallah ta'ala next time with more verses in Surah Al-Ahzab. But before we end, I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for coming in these beautiful recitation. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our families and our women and our children and everyone by being obedient to Allah and by submitting themselves to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم